So thanks for the invitation. I think this is the first time I present this project in Austria, virtually in Austria. So I'm really looking forward to your feedback and comments. So as Agnes said in the introduction, this is about pension reforms and looking at pension reforms in Austria. So why is this important? Demographic change, massive demographic change, lets policymakers across the world think about how to reform pension systems. And to illustrate how massive demographic change is, it's illustrative to show you population pyramids. So here you see the population pyramid for Europe and North America in the year 1950. So the population pyramid just shows you the distribution by age in the population. And so in 1950, this was really a pyramid, meaning that there are more young individuals than old individuals. By 2050, this is projected to look very differently. So the population pyramid will lose its shape, and it looks much more like a mushroom than a pyramid. And this is, of course, a huge challenge for our pension systems, especially for our pay-as-you-go pension systems, where the currently young generation pays the pensions of the currently old generation. Now, such a pay-as-you-go system worked perfectly fine in 1950 because for each individual above age 65, we had around 6 individuals in the working age. By 2050, that ratio is down to 2. So just 2 individuals working for each retiree. And this just means we have to reform our pension system. And the key question that I'm working on is how to do this. And so if you ask an economist, how should you do something? The economists want to look at welfare effects of changes in that system. And this is where this paper is going. So what should we do? How should we reform our pension systems to address this massive demographic change? So the economist's answer is very simple. It's 70 or bust, why the retirement age must go up. And so the reasoning in that special report was, okay, people live longer. If we increase the retirement age, they just work longer. And so problem solved. Of course, there are many other margins in the pension system that we can adjust. We can reduce pension generosity, just pay lower pensions to everybody, change the penalty for retiring early or the bonus if you retire later, or simply increase contributions. And so where I'm going with this paper is I'm basically doing 2 things. So first, I provide a framework to think about trade-offs in pension reforms that allows me to compare all types of different adjustments with the same formula. And the idea will be in a sufficient statistic sense that the model is relatively general and tells us, okay, we need to look at these margins, and this gives us the whole trade-off. And these margins, or part of these margins, we can estimate reduced for. So that's the first part of the paper, deriving this framework to think about welfare effects of pension reforms. In the interest of time, I will be very short on the framework part today and talk more about the empirics, which is the second part of the paper, where I take this framework to the data and use this great variation that we have with all these Austrian pension reforms to causally estimate the effect of increasing the early retirement age and reducing pension levels. And then in light of the framework, I'll talk about potential welfare effects of those reforms and how the estimates I provide are informative to think about these trade-offs. So this is where the journey is going. I'll be very brief, just 2 slides on the framework, and then we'll jump into the empirics. Okay, so for the framework, think about any pension reform basically as taking away $1 from a retiree and putting that $1 in public funds. And different pension reforms just target different individuals. So if we increase the early retirement age, we take away $1 from people who retire early. If we cut pension levels, we take away $1 from all retirees. So on the benefit side of this $1 reduction in pension payments, public funds will increase by at least $1. We take away $1, we save $1 in expenditures. Now, on top of that, we also expect that people adjust their behavior in response to the changes in the rules. So if we reduce pension levels, some people might no longer want to retire early, work longer to offset their losses. So on top of that mechanical saving of $1, we also expect that people respond to the reform and might work longer, pay more payroll taxes, generating additional fiscal revenue. So that's the fiscal side of a pension reform, and that's what I'll call the multiplier of a reform. That's basically measuring the fiscal impact, the total fiscal impact of a reform, thinking about this $1 metric. That makes it comparable across different reforms and is therefore very handy to think about when comparing different reforms. So that's the benefit side of a reform. Like on the cost side, taking away $1 is also costly because $1 in the hand of the retiree was also valued by that retiree. And so I will not talk much about the cost side of a reform. So that's what I call the social value of the dollar. What it basically is the relative valuation of having $1 in the hand of a retiree versus having that $1 in public fund. So that's going to be the mysterious object. I'll give you a bit more background in the next slide, but the empirical analysis will mostly focus on the multiplier because that's basically estimating the fiscal effect of a pension reform, and that's something we can do with data and with reforms. So the empirics will focus on estimating the multiplier. And then, of course, a reform is welfare improving if the multiplier exceeds kind of the social value of the dollar, so the benefits exceed costs. That's the logic of the whole formula. So slightly more details on what's going on and how I will estimate it. So the right-hand side is the multiplier. It's basically just the total fiscal effect of a reform divided by the mechanical fiscal effect of a reform. And the mechanical fiscal effect of a reform is how much money would we save if people would not respond to the reform at all. So that, if you think back to the $1 example, it would just be 1. The multiplier would just be 1 if people do not respond at all. So that's the right-hand side of the formula. That will estimate reduced form with all the variation we have in Austria. The left-hand side is this mysterious object, the social value of the dollar. And so what it basically is you can think about any reform as changing the pension formula in direction of another function, H. And so think about this as a specific reform takes away $H from a specific set of individuals. $1 of the affected individual is valued at the marginal utility of consumption, and at the aggregate level, it's multiplied by a social welfare rate. So that's basically how valuable is $1 in the hand of the affected individuals of that reform. So this can differ by reforms, that different individuals are affected by different reforms. And then it's divided by lambda, which is the multiplier on the government budget constraint, which tells us how valuable is $1 in public funds. And so this would be a money metric of that transfer from the individuals to public funds. Now, the issue with that is, of course, this is very hard to measure. We don't really know what the social value of the dollar is. There's all kinds of things going in there, and it's not directly related to moments in the data. So I'm coming back to this issue, but first, let's focus on the positive side. So we can estimate one side of the equation, and then we already get a sense of how high or low the other side could be, that we have a welfare improving or welfare reducing reform. So what I'll do in the empirical part that I'm presenting to you now is I'll estimate the multiplier of these two reforms, increasing the early retirement age and reducing pension generosity. And I do that by first estimating the total fiscal effect of a reform, then calculate the mechanical fiscal effect. So how much would we have saved if people would not respond to the reform? Just holding behavior fixed, how much would this reform save in terms of expenditures? And then the multiplier is just total fiscal effect divided by mechanical. So now I'm taking you to the empirics, estimating total fiscal effect, mechanical effect, and then this gives me the multiplier in the end. So empirically, a quick preview where the journey is going. So for increasing the early retirement age, I find a multiplier between 0.4 to 0.7. So meaning that trying to save $1 by increasing the early retirement age, you actually don't save $1, you just save 40 to 70 cents. And this is a surprising result. So I had a very different prior when I started working on this. But you would think that, okay, if you increase the early retirement age, people cannot retire early anymore. So they work longer, pay more payroll taxes, generate additional fiscal revenue, and so you would end up with a multiplier above 1. So what's going on is that indeed some people work longer, they pay more payroll taxes, but at the same time, some people, and a significant share of people, spends more time in unemployment, gets more unemployment benefits, which generates additional expenditures. And on that, these two effects cancel. And on top of these two effects, there's also an entitlement effect that if people claim later, they're entitled to higher pensions, and this generates additional expenditures in the future, which pushes the multiplier below 1. Okay? So increasing the early retirement age is a multiplier below 1. Now for reducing pension levels, I find multipliers between 1.4 to 1.7. So a $1 reduction in pension levels generates an additional 40 to 70 cents additional fiscal revenue by people delaying claiming, working longer, providing additional payroll taxes, and reducing pension payments during the spell they work longer. Okay, so if you just look at the multiplier side of this, the fiscal impact side, it's not 70 or bust, as the economist suggests. Reducing pension levels works much better than increasing the early retirement age. Of course, then this is only one part of the equation. The other part will be the social value of the dollar. So this could still overturn all my results if the $1 in the hand of all retirees is valued much more than $1 in the hands of early retirees. To address this a little bit, I look at the incidence of these two reforms across the lifetime income distribution. And what I'll show you is that the incidence is very similar. So it seems that across the lifetime income distribution, the incidence of those two reforms is very similar. And so it's very hard to argue that the social value of the dollar would be very different between these two reforms. And given that the multipliers are so strikingly different, conclusion seems to be that it's more beneficial to reduce pension levels than increasing the early retirement age, if you do a relative comparison. Okay, so that's the paper in a nutshell. Now we get into the more details, how I actually get and estimate the multipliers. So Austria is a fantastic setup because we have great registry data dating back to 72, and we have a lot of pension reforms. So 7 pension reforms since the 80s that both changed the early retirement age and also showing here the red line, the pension levels. So there's a lot of action. For the early retirement age, I'll use the reform in 2000 that stepwise increased the early retirement age. And for the pension levels, I'll show you evidence from the 88 reform that stepwise reduced generosity of pensions. So for the early retirement age, I use the staggered introduction or staggered increase in the early retirement age by quarter of birth. So for women, the early retirement age increased from 55 to 60. For men, it increased from 60 to 65. And this was phased in by quarter of birth. So if you were born before October 45, your early retirement age is 55. If you're born in the quarter just after, it's 55 plus 2 months. Another quarter after is 55 plus 4 months, and so on. And so I'm exploiting this with a cohort difference in difference. Basically comparing this quarter of birth that have 55 will be my control group. And then I have different treatment groups for a 2-month increase, a treatment group for a 4-month increase, a treatment group for a 6 months increase, and so on, all the way up to 1.5 years increase. So that's going to be the difference in difference. And I'm estimating this by age in months so that I can also look at the timing of effects. And the key outcome that I'm after, if I want to get at the multipliers, is fiscal revenue. And the way I define fiscal revenue is payroll taxes minus old age pension expenditures, disability benefits, unemployment insurance benefits, and sick leave benefits. So basically what I can observe in the Social Security data is my measure of fiscal revenue. And then from the fiscal revenue estimate, I'll go to the multiplier. I also look at what's going on in the labor market, but I won't have much time to talk about this today. All right, so this is the first set of results. This is the comparison of the control group who had age 55 to the first treatment group who had age 55 plus 2 months. So the reform, first you see before they knew about the reform, that's the dashed line, they learned 3 months before they turned 55 that their retirement age, their early retirement age will be increased by 2 months. So before the reform, you don't see any action. So that's a good news for parallel trends for the diff that we need. And then in the very short anticipation window of 3 months, we also don't see any effects, which might not be that surprising. It's a very short period of time to react. And then in those 2 months that they couldn't retire anymore compared to the control group, we see savings of around 500 euros per person in our sample. And then as soon as they turn 55 and 2 months, the effect is gone. And it stays around 0 afterwards. So it's a very limited response in this window where the retirement age increased. Okay, so that's just the first group. You can also look at the other groups, and it looks strikingly similar across all these treatment groups, which I find very interesting. So this is the comparison. Control group had age 55 towards the treatment group who had a 1 year increase and their new early retirement age was 56. So they learned around 1.5 years before they turned 55 that their retirement age will be increased, their early retirement age will be increased by 1 year. So they had a long anticipation window, but still you don't see any detectable effects before they turn 55. To some degree, that's also surprising because you would think if you know that you can't retire at 55 anymore, you have, and for instance, you're unemployed at 53, you have a strong incentive to look for a new job because you can't just rely on retirement, unemployment benefits and then transition into retirement. But we don't see much going on that front. And then as soon as they turn 55, then we see around the similar effects, 500 euros per person for each month for a whole year. And then as soon as they reach the new early retirement age, the effect is gone again. And this is consistent or the similar picture across all groups. And also it looks very similar for men who had an increase from 60 to 65. Okay, so that's the fiscal total fiscal effect estimates that I have. Now, if you want to get to the multiplier, the question is how much of this fiscal effect is mechanical and how much is due to behavior. Okay, so I can directly calculate the mechanical effect, and that's the red area here. And so the short answer is that the total fiscal effect that I estimate is purely mechanical. And so this raises the question, what is actually going on? People must respond to increasing the early retirement age, right? So what is going on is that some people do work longer. So they generate additional payroll taxes. That's the green line. But at the same time, some individuals spend more time in unemployment. That's the red dashed line. And this creates additional expenditures. And the green and red dashed line are almost of similar magnitude. And so these two adjustments in behavior cancel. And so that's why the total fiscal effect equals the total mechanical effect. And so this is the table for all treatment groups for women. You see between the old and new early retirement age, the fiscal and mechanical effect are strikingly similar for all treatment groups. Now, there's an additional effect above the new early retirement age, which, because people claim later, they have more insurance years, and so they are entitled to higher benefits. This is extremely hard to detect with my diff in diff because it's around 20 euros per year based on the labor supply responses. And so I impute that value. And then because people are unemployed in retirement for 30 years, this is a sizable amount. And so just looking between the old and new early retirement age would imply a multiplier of 1. Accounting for these dynamic effects of higher pension entitlement pushes the multiplier below 1. So the multiplier lies always between 0.5 to around 0.6, 0.7. Very similar picture for men. Okay, so that's my results for the early retirement age. Then moving to pension levels, what I do there is I exploit the reform in '88 that changed how the assessment basis and entered the pension levels. So in Austria, it used to be the case that the pension was determined by the assessment basis. That's your average earnings over a certain period of time multiplied by the pension coefficient, which is the replacement rate. And so what the '88 reform did was it increased the assessment period from the average earnings over the last 10 years to the average earnings over the last 15 years. And so if you have increasing wage profiles, that means that on average, this reduced pension generosity because your average earnings over the last 10 years tend to be higher than the average earnings over the last 15 years if you have seniority wage profiles. And this reform was again phased in by date of birth. So for men, if you were born before January 1st, 28, you were not affected by the reform, and it was your last 10 years of earnings that counted for the pension. For men born after January 28 till December 28, the assessment period was increased to the earnings over the last 11 years. And so there's a sharp cutoff at January 1st, 28, or January 1st, 32 for women, where pension generosity discontinuously changes. And so I exploit that in a regression discontinuity design. So that's the figure of the outcome is again fiscal revenue, and date of birth is January 1st, 28 for men. What's the average fiscal revenue for people at age 60? And you see that this change in pension generosity translates to a discontinuity in fiscal effects exactly at the cutoff. So it jumps up. To the left, pensions were more generous. To the right, pensions became less generous. So you also see that in total fiscal effect. And here's the similar figure. These are all the RD estimates at each age over time. So again, we see before 59, before people were 59, they did not, there's no difference at the cutoff. That's good news for the validity of the RD. And at age 60, this massive jump in fiscal revenue that fades out and hovers around the mechanical fiscal effect after age 65, where almost everybody is retired. Okay? So in terms of fiscal effects, changing pension levels is different than increasing the early retirement age, because there's a long-lasting mechanical effect for all ages because you permanently cut pension benefits. And so what you see in that figure is that between 60 and 65, there is adjustment in behavior. And what's going on is that people delay retirement, they work longer, they pay more payroll taxes, that's the green line. But kind of the big savings are actually that when people work longer, you don't have to pay the pensions. And so that's the red dashed line that's generating much more savings than the payroll taxes itself. And you see that phase out, and at 65, it's around the mechanical effect. And the cool thing about reform in '88 is that you can look up to the age of 85 and see what's going on in the long run. Okay, and then the picture looks very similar for women. And then we have to basically add up all these things again. So this is just a table adding up the point estimates before. Effect between early retirement age and normal retirement age. So a large fiscal effect that is much larger than the mechanical effect if people would not respond. And then again, above the normal retirement age, there's this dynamic effect going on. So it's not just that you have the mechanical effect that you pay lower pensions, and this is all that's going on after everybody's retired, because people work longer, they have higher entitlement, and so you see the total fiscal savings is actually much less than the mechanical effect you would expect from cutting benefits above age 65. So it's around 1/3 of the mechanical effect. And then summing up the total effect, you get a multiplier of 1.7 for men and 1.4 for women. All right, so we're moving forward. I'm running almost out of time. So far it's 0.5 to 0.7 for early retirement age, 0.14, 0.7 for reducing pension levels. So now you can also say, well, these reforms took place in very different periods of time. One was 88, the other was in 2000. So I also used the 2003-2004 reform where the early retirement age and the pension level changed at the same time to confirm my results. So that's basically using the variation here after 2003. It's less clean, but I get very similar results. That's again, I think, for women, reducing pension levels, multiplier of 1.6, increasing early retirement age, multiplier of 1.4. So that's the bottom line. I can talk empirically about the fiscal effects. If we want to go and bridge the gap to the welfare implications, we also need to talk about the social value of the dollar, so the other side of the equation. Very good, 5 minutes. So basically if we just look at the fiscal implications, it's very clear that pension levels is a much better idea than increasing the retirement age to curb Social Security spending. For the social value of the dollar, so I look at lifetime income by decile and calculate what's the incidence of this reform across these different lifetime income deciles. So again, this is normalized by the mechanical effect. So a $1 reduction in expenditures, mechanical reduction in expenditures for reducing pension levels, are the gray bars, is around is a reduction of 30 cents for the lowest decile and around 2.4 euros or dollars for the top decile. So you see that progressively, the way the reform was implemented, people at the top were more affected. So you can do the same thing for increasing for an increase of the early retirement age. And here it's just a question of who retires early. And it turns out that in Austria, across the lifetime income distribution, a lot of people retire early. So there's no gradient in who retires early. And so the red line shows a very similar incidence across the lifetime income distribution for increasing the early retirement age, because people with higher income tend to have higher pensions. And so those two things seem to have a very similar incidence across the lifetime income distribution, which strongly suggests that the social value of the dollar might be very similar for these two reforms. So if that's the case, and multipliers are much bigger for the pension level reduction than for the early retirement age reduction, this leads to the conclusion that in terms of welfare, it's a better idea to reduce pension levels than increase the early retirement age. So that's the main message of the paper. And so if you want to think about the more general message of my analysis, is that it seems key that we take spillovers to other programs into account if we think about reforming the pension system. So basically, the spillover to unemployment completely killed any positive effect of increasing the early retirement age in Austria. More generally, this speaks to the fact that pension reforms can only be effective if older workers actually can work longer and face favorable job opportunities. And so in terms of policy implications, what seems to be clear is that what we need to think about more is it's not just we can adjust the pension system and then people automatically work longer. It's really about how can we improve labor market opportunities of older workers. Because what you see for the increase in the early retirement age is that people who have a job, they stay in their job and work longer if the early retirement age increases. People who don't have a job and are on unemployment benefits, for instance, they don't transition back to the labor market, find a job, work more. This is not going on. So they stay unemployed and generate these negative fiscal externalities. All right, that's all I wanted to talk about. Now I'm looking forward to the comments and your feedback.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for the overview of Austrian pension data. Benjamin, do you have slides to share, or do you want to just give your comments without? No, you have slides. I see. You're still muted, by the way.
Okay,
Just
thank
that
you.
know.
So,
Okay.
now I hope you can see my slides.
Yes, we can.
And I start. Okay. So thank you very much, Andreas, for this great presentation. Though that is really an incredible deep paper, and that makes it almost a bit difficult to discuss, because whenever I thought about something you could have done, I looked up in the paper, and the paper has 144 pages. So it's rather a book than a paper, though the robustness check is there. So on the other hand, that was good for me, because that allowed me to not concentrate on the technical topics, so to say, but perhaps a bit more on policy implications. So also what you just said about policy reform options. So I just want to start with a short summary of the paper. Do you see now contribution of the paper, or still? No, it should be the contribution of the paper, right?
We see the contribution, yes.
Okay, perfect. So the paper is about providing a missing link between empirical estimates from normal program evaluation literature to really welfare consequences of pension reforms. And so normally we see a paper, I would say, of each of these reforms. So that could be easily 3 papers, which is in Andreas' paper 1 paper. And moreover, it's about preparing also the welfare consequences of these pension reforms. And the welfare effects depend heavily on the fiscal multiplier, so as Andreas just explained. And the paper also shows the challenges for this sufficient statistic approach in a pension reform context. So up to now, that approach was mostly concentrated on unemployment insurance, because there it's much easier to apply, because you have not this intergenerational aspect, but you have aspects of people who are currently working, and you distribute to the currently not working. And that is not that easy in to transfer that approach to a pension reform context. And content-wise, so what we just saw is that increasing the early retirement age has much smaller multipliers than the pension generosity reforms. I will start with one different issue, because that was a bit also your motivation from the start, and it was in the paper about that reforms are inevitable to avoid financial collapse. So that's probably a bit harsh in the Austrian context. So what we see here are long-term projections of pension spending in Austria until 2070, and we also see the effects of these reforms you have just presented, especially this reform in 2003 and 2004, which was not now in the presentation. But what we can see is that the pension spending due to the reforms will in future be pretty stable as a share of GDP. So that's just perhaps, I know, so for the motivation is good, but so I would say it's not about collapsing. So then I will come to the reform. So what was for me really striking is that the increase in the early retirement age does have significant positive fiscal revenue effects. So you find effects of 500 euros for each month, increasing the early retirement age for women, and 650 euros for men. But then the behavioral fiscal effect is 0, because most of this fiscal effect is substituted with payments from the unemployment insurance, and though we come to this 0 effect. So increasing retirement age alone does not generate these large multipliers, or in your case from 0.4 to 0.7. So what then was coming in my mind, that is Austria is among the worst countries considering healthy life years. So for women, we have 59.3 years only, and for men, 58.2 years, which makes us in the 21st position from 27 or 20th position from 27 in the whole EU. So we have rather low expectation in healthy life years, and that translates into labor force participation rates that are also considerably below average in Austria compared to the EU in general. So what I was thinking about that perhaps the multipliers you find for Austria are rather on the lower side of multipliers, or that there is really a lot of room for improvement of these multipliers to push them towards one if these other issues you have just spoken about in the end of your presentation would be tackled. So that is really a thing of not only making pension reforms, but to make integrated reforms, in my view, so or my takeaway from that paper. And though I'm coming to this generosity reform from 1988, and here is a bit of a flip side. So the population that was targeted, and that becomes clear in the paper, are really men at the top of the income distribution. So if we redistribute from them, that makes it quite likely that there are welfare improvements. And also the sample, I would say, you have descriptive statistics about that, is perhaps a bit selected. So it's relatively high income, relatively healthy, low unemployment. And that is where I was suspecting that these multipliers could be potentially overestimated, in the sense that there is one of the first reforms targeting this generosity, and I would expect that there is a decreasing welfare effect perhaps of this pension level multiplier reforms. We don't see it really in the reforms that you have not presented, 2003 and 2004. However, so that's a bit of a different identification approach, and perhaps you can say something about how good these parameters you think are identified in that second approach, or whether you really also think that there might be a downward development of this multiplier over time. And then just some further issues that's related with the last point. So all the reform in 2003 and 2004 is a long time ago now, like 20 years, where the Austrian labor market undergone significant changes. So the economic crisis, EU opening to the east, increased immigration, and so on. So what would we expect, or are these multipliers, do they inform really policymakers today, or are they really bound to these historic periods where you estimate the effects? A second issue, so what is not in the paper, are political economy aspects of reforms. So how feasible are pension generosity reforms compared to increasing retirement age reforms? And I think probably it's easier nowadays to increase retirement age than really to tackle the generosity of reforms. And the last point is about your fiscal revenue. So the Austrian pension system is now considerably tax financed, so nearly one quarter of the finance is tax financed. You have a data-driven fiscal revenue, which is so to say social contributions and payroll taxes. And I was curious if you would consider VAT or debt financing or other issues, if that would change your multiplier. So that were my short comments, and thank you again. It was really incredible presentation. Yeah.
Thanks again, Benjamin. And now that I know you read 100 pages or more, thanks again for providing the comment. And Andreas, do you want to react directly, or do you want to collect or see if there are any other remarks or questions from the...
I can quickly respond. So first of all, sorry for the 140 pages. That's what happens with job market papers. So I think your comments are very well taken. So I agree, it's a local evaluation, right? So it's hard to project what would happen in other countries, what would happen today in Austria if we change. Kind of the more general lesson that I took away from this exercise is that once you're at 59, 62, there seems to be a lot of friction in the labor market. And so just changing the pension system will only work if you actually have high labor force participation. And that's one of the issues that Austria had. And we have other papers looking at the disability insurance Tätigkeitsschutz, where you can go at 57. And this had huge effects on labor supply at age 57, 58, 59, 60, that massively improved. So it's really an interplay of these different systems. Regarding fiscal revenue, so what I did is I also have one extensions hidden in those 140 pages where I take income taxes into account. And this changes the multiplier slightly, but in the same way for both reforms. So it increases both multipliers by around 0.1. So the relative comparison stands. VAT is going to be impossible to do, but I expect that it won't change kind of the qualitative results that I had, because these are very second order effects that will show up. All right. Yeah, that was my initial response. Maybe I've forgotten something, but thanks for the comments. Well taken.
Thank you very much. We have 2 remarks from the audience. Christine, you're on top of my list. Yes, ja.
Mit Blick auf die TeilnehmerInnen werde ich jetzt mir erlauben, auf Deutsch weiterzureden, weil lauter hausinterne Menschen hier sind. Vielen Dank für die Präsentation, vielen Dank für die Arbeit, sehr spannend. Ein paar kleine Ergänzungen zu dem, was Benjamin Bittschi gesagt hat. Es ist der Arbeitsmarkt für Ältere jetzt sehr viel anders aufgestellt als zu dem Zeitpunkt, wo die Reformen durchgeführt wurden. Wir haben vor 1,5 Jahren eine Studie durchgeführt, wo wir uns angeschaut haben, bei den Frauen, wie der Pensionübertritt erfolgt ist. Und wir haben gesehen, dass der Anteil der Direktpensionsübertritte, also der Frauen, die von einer aktiven sozialversicherungspflichtigen Beschäftigung in die Pension übergetreten sind, rückläufig gewesen ist. Trotz der Reformen, trotz der Abschaffung des vorzeitigen Pensionsübertrittes rückläufig war und dass bei den unselbstständig erwerbstätigen Frauen gerade mal 48% aus einer aktiven Beschäftigung in die Pension übertreten. Das heißt, wir haben hier eine unglaublich große Gruppe, die, so wie Sie gesagt haben, auf Arbeitslosenunterstützung angewiesen ist. Und insofern ist sozusagen der Arbeitsmarkt für Ältere, glaube ich, der Hebel dafür, wie die fiskalischen Effekte sind, wo sozusagen der größere Effekt zu erwarten ist, ob es durch die Erhöhung des Antrittsalters ist oder ob die Reduktion der Ersatzrate ist. Und hier zeigt sich ganz klar, dass beispielsweise bei den selbstständig Erwerbstätigen der Direktübertritt häufiger ist, wo sozusagen eine Gestaltungsmöglichkeit ist, am Erwerbsarbeitsmarkt zu verbleiben, werden die Anreize stärker wahrgenommen der längeren Beschäftigung. Dort, wo Betriebe mitspielen, was die Beendigung der Beschäftigung bedeutet, dort sehen wir eben eine unglaublich große Lücke. Und sozusagen, ich glaube, der Ansatzpunkt, Sie haben es auch genannt, ganz zum Schluss, sind tatsächlich die Betriebe, weil wir sprechen immer sozusagen auf Anreizwirkungen der betroffenen Beschäftigten und das Pensionssystem, das Alterssicherungssystem. Aber der dritte Player, nämlich die Betriebe, sind hier wirklich gefordert. Und wir hatten, und damit komme ich jetzt zum Schluss, wir hatten da auch eine Betriebsbefragung mitgemacht, wo wir abgefragt haben, wie die Betriebe, wie ausgezeichnete Betriebe, die sozusagen eine Auszeichnung bekommen haben, weil sie einen guten Arbeitsmarkt für ältere Beschäftigte bieten, wie diese Betriebe vorbereitet sind für das steigende Pensionsantrittsalter der Frauen. Und siehe da, niemand in diesen ausgezeichneten Betrieben hat dieses steigende Antrittsalter auf dem Radar. Niemand macht Personalpolitik diesbezüglich, dass Frauen länger in Zukunft in Beschäftigung verbleiben. Also ich kann das sozusagen nur unterstreichen und betonen, dass eben der dritte Akteur, nämlich die Betriebe, hier maßgeblich entscheiden darüber, wo die Effekte größer sind, wo sozusagen der Multiplier größer ist, bei der einen Reform des Antrittsalters oder bei dem Pensionsniveau. Dankeschön.
Das ist ein spannender Punkt. wir haben gerade vor 2 Wochen angefangen, ein Projekt zu machen in Norwegen, weil hier müssen die Firmen einen Teil bezahlen, wenn sie Leute in Frührente schicken. Und es scheint, als ob das sehr große Effekte hat. Aber wir werden sehen. Also das ist ein sehr guter Kommentar. Die Firmen sind absolut vergessen gegangen bis jetzt eigentlich. Das sehe ich genau gleich. Ja.
Gabriel.
Ja, vielen Dank. Das erste, was ich sagen wollte, ist, das war beeindruckend, wirklich sehr spannend. Ich habe gelernt, ich bin ja alles andere als ein Pensionsexperte, aber ich muss ja auch immer besser verstehen, wie das österreichische Pensionssystem funktioniert und auch die Kommentare von Benjamin und auch die Remarks von der Christine sehr, sehr nützlich für mich. Vielen herzlichen Dank. Ich habe eine Frage eigentlich. Wenn wir von Welfare-Effekt sprechen, da kann man natürlich sehr weit ausholen. Nicht? Also man kann auch fragen, wenn da mehr Menschen arbeiten am Ende, dann schaffen die ja auch anderswo Wertschöpfung. Nicht? Also wenn es Komplementaritäten gibt zwischen Arbeit und Kapital, dann passiert da irgendwas. Und wir haben ja eine große Diskussion in Österreich über Knappheiten, Mangel. Kann man das kann man sicher irgendwie auch sozusagen in die Gleichung aufnehmen, dass da sozusagen im allgemeinen Gleichgewicht noch sehr viel mehr passiert, das auch wohlfahrtsrelevant ist am Arbeitsmarkt selber. Und dann natürlich auch noch weiter, wenn man sagt, Pensionssystem wird gekürzt, dann wenn es da Kürzungen gibt, dann würde man ja erwarten, dass es auch andere Substitutionseffekte gibt. Also nicht nur mehr arbeiten oder so, sondern auch, dass man vielleicht mehr spart. Und dann hat man in einer in der keynesianischen Ökonomie möglicherweise auch wieder aggregierte Effekte, weil die Leute sagen, Pension, die kann ich mir nicht mehr verlassen, die liefert nicht, muss ich mir anderswo sozusagen eine Polster anlegen. Also das ist die Frage nach der, kann man das sozusagen, würdest du sagen, das sind vernachlässigbare Geschichten, die gibt es vielleicht auch, aber alles Second oder Third Order, wenn du zum Bundeskanzler gehen müsstest, oder würdest du sagen, wenn man das wirklich als Grundlage verwenden will für eine vernünftige Arbeitsmarkt- oder eine Pensionsreform, dann muss ich auch diese GE-Effekte mit berücksichtigen.
Das ist ein sehr guter Punkt. GE-Effekte sind natürlich unglaublich schwierig zu schätzen, irgendwie statistisch. Was aber mittlerweile mehr kommt in der Literatur, denke ich. Also es gibt Papers im italienischen Kontext, wo sie schauen, was hat das für einen Effekt, wenn sie das Antrittsalter erhöhen auf Hiring from Young, also von jungen Arbeitskräften. Die finden da nicht allzu viel. Ich glaube, so mein Gefühl ist ein bisschen, wenn wir jetzt darüber sprechen, 2-monatige Erhöhung Pensionsalter, dann sind GE-Effekte Second Order. Wenn wir darüber sprechen, 5 Jahre Erhöhung, dann stellt sich die Frage viel mehr, in welche Richtung das gehen konnte. Und ich glaube, die kurze Antwort ist, wir wissen es nicht. Oder wir wissen es noch nicht. Und ich glaube, da kommt jetzt immer mehr und mehr Forschung dazu, wo man irgendwie clever diese Setups ausnützt, um was dazu zu sagen. Aber aktuell haben wir keine gute Evidenz, was genau passieren würde in Sachen Sparverhalten oder auch Preiseffekte von dem. Was wir angefangen haben hier in Norwegen ist, wir haben die Konsum- und Wealth-Daten und dort schauen wir jetzt an, wie eine Pensionsreform das Sparverhalten ändert. Aber das ist noch zu früh, um das zu kommentieren. Aber wir arbeiten daran. Das sind genau Punkte, die mich auch beschäftigen.
Vielen Dank. Und es ist super, wenn mit österreichischen Daten weitergearbeitet wird. Das österreichische Institut für Wirtschaftsforschung ich finde das extrem nützlich und bereichert der Fundus an empirischen Arbeit, aus den wir ziehen können. Also das ist großartig. Und wenn noch so erfolgreich abläuft wie hier jetzt bei dir, dann umso besser. Das ist die beste Werbung, die es geben kann für österreichische Daten und für ihre Verwendung und dann auch potenzielle Hebel, bessere Wirtschaftspolitik und Pensionspolitik in Österreich zu machen, auf Basis dieser Erkenntnisse. Also, danke sehr.
Ja, danke.
Okay, gibt es sonst aus dem Publikum noch Anmerkungen? Ich sehe jetzt gerade noch keine. Sonst hätte ich nämlich 2 Punkte, 2 kleine Anmerkungen zu dem gerade Gesagten. Eine einerseits, ich bin mir nicht sicher, wenn der Grund oder einer der Hauptgründe ist, dass die Reform, das Pensionsantrittsalter zu heben, keinen besonders großen Multiplikator aufweist, der ist, dass die Leute arbeitslos gemeldet sind vorab. Und wenn die Theorie von Benjamin, die er angedeutet hat, stimmen könnte, dass das deshalb so ist, weil ältere Menschen in Österreich tendenziell nicht besonders gesund sind und altersbedingt dann aus gesundheitlichen, egal ob psychisch oder physische gesundheitliche Probleme also nicht mehr arbeitsfähig sind, dann würde das dem Arbeitskräftemangel, den wir in Österreich haben, jetzt auch nicht wirklich rausreißen, glaube ich, weil die Leute dann sowieso vom Arbeitsmarkt weg wären. Insofern würde ich davon ausgehen, dass die Zweitrundeneffekte bei der Sache, zumindest bei kleinen bei kleinen Änderungen im Pensionsantrittsalter dann tatsächlich vernachlässigbar wären. Und der zweite Punkt, den ich habe, ist eigentlich bezogen auf einen Kommentar von dir, Benjamin, nämlich dein Political Economy Approach Ansatz. Ich habe mir da gedacht, ich bin mir nicht sicher, ob es tatsächlich nicht eher feasible ist, das Pensionsgeld ein bisschen zu reduzieren, rein politisch betrachtet, insbesondere wenn ich mir überlege, welche Generationen da jetzt nachkommen und wie Work-Life-Balances von Generationen oder generell die Freizeit mittlerweile anders bewertet wird. Und ich bin mir nicht sicher, ob es da nicht in den nächsten Generationen schon ein Umdenken gibt, dass mir 1-2 Jahre mehr Pension oder frühere Pension vielleicht doch ganz schön viel wert sind. Ich weiß es nicht, aber ich bin auch keine Pensionsexpertin, also das ist eher so ein bisschen eine Frage, ob es hier nicht vielleicht auch intergenerationale Änderungen absehbar sind.
Darf ich da gleich noch was
Uli.
nachschießen? Ja, weil das passt jetzt vielleicht dazu. Es ist so ein bisschen ein anderes Thema, aber was ich auch ganz spannend finde in dem Kontext ist, es gibt ja internationale Evidenz dafür, dass es eine Auswirkung hat, wann mein Partner, meine Partnerin in Pension geht. Jetzt sehen wir eine Angleichung des Pensionsantrittsalters in Österreich bis 2034. Und wenn wir davon ausgehen, dass die Partnerin, sagen wir im Durchschnitt so, ich glaube wahrscheinlich so 2 Jahre, 3 Jahre jünger ist, dann wird das auch einen Effekt haben. Ne? Und das ist sozusagen für zukünftige Pensionsreformen wahrscheinlich auch ein Punkt, den man berücksichtigen sollte. Und mir persönlich tut es weh, dass ich 6 Jahre nach meinem Mann in Pension gehe. Also das ist 6 Jahre, das macht schon was, ne, wenn man sich das überlegt. Ne?
Ja, ich bin ganz bei dir, Uli. Christine.
Die Kunst von Pensionsreformen ist sozusagen von diesem Durchschnitt, den wir jetzt gehört haben, den der Herr Haller, der Andreas Haller dargestellt hat, ein bisschen wegkommen, besonders dann, wenn es um Pensionshöhen geht. Nur kurz ein paar Zahlen dazu. Es ist in Österreich, der Herr Haller hat davon gesprochen, dass das Antrittsalter der Männer 65 ist. Tatsächlich ist es so, dass 80% der Männer vorzeitig in Pension gehen, nämlich mit spätestens 63 weg sind. Und sozusagen 65 hier schon eine ordentliche Manövriermasse wäre, um das Arbeitskräfteangebot zu erhöhen. Also da ist, würde ich sagen, noch viel Spielraum nach oben. Und zum anderen sehen wir, dass das Frauenpensionsantrittsalter ist im Moment bei 60 und dass hier nur knapp 15% der Frauen lange Versicherungszeiten haben und vorzeitig in Pension gehen. Dass sozusagen die Frauen länger am Arbeitsmarkt bleiben, gleichzeitig durch ihre Erwerbskarriere natürlich enorm geringere Pensionen haben. Also insofern, wenn wir da von Pensionskürzungen reden, glaube ich, sollte man weggehen vom Durchschnitt, sondern tatsächlich hingehen zu diesen jedenfalls riesig großen geschlechterspezifischen Unterschieden in Österreich sowie in Deutschland. In der Schweiz weiß ich nicht, wie es ist, aber jedenfalls ganz anders wie in Norwegen oder Schweden. Also insofern, glaube ich, ist so eine Durchschnittsbetrachtung wichtig, zeigt Wichtiges auf, aber genauer zu schauen, besonders die Genderlinie, glaube ich, ist hier enorm wichtig.
Ja,
Christine? Ja.
Also, bitte, ich wollte
Nein, bitte. Machen Sie.
Ja, also ich gebe Ihnen recht. Es gibt einen großen Unterschied. Was ich auch noch sagen wollte, ist, es gibt noch einen Unterschied zwischen Early Retirement Age und Normal Retirement Age. Und was wir von der Forschung wissen, ist, dass eigentlich sozusagen das Normal Retirement Age zu erhöhen, das hat ganz andere Effekte als Early Retirement Age. Und was Arthur Seibold und andere gezeigt haben, ist, dass wenn man eigentlich sozusagen das Normal Retirement Age ist, einfach zu sagen, ja, 65 ist normal. Und das kann Rieseneffekte haben über so Referenzpunkte, dass das sehr positive Effekte hat. Und dort hat man dann auch nicht diese negativen Spillovers, weil man immer noch vorher gehen kann und nicht auf andere Benefits substituieren muss. Also die Unterscheidung ist auch noch wichtig, dass das nicht das genau gleiche ist. Und ich glaube, 2024 wird ja dann das Normal Retirement Age für Frauen angehoben. Also das wird auch spannend, was dann da genau passiert. Ja, das ist das, was ich gesagt habe.
Danke, dann das war ein wichtiger Hinweis auch, dass das Normal und das Early Retirement Age hier unterschiedliche Effekte haben. Eine Änderung. Okay, gibt es sonst noch Kommentare, Fragen, Anmerkungen? Dann haben wir heute eine Punktlandung hingelegt zeitlich. Ich darf mich herzlich bedanken bei unseren Vortragenden heute. Herr Haller, war wirklich eine spannende Präsentation und auch eine sehr spannende Diskussion. Wir freuen uns auf viele weitere Papiere von Ihnen mit unseren österreichischen Daten. Wir sind schon sehr gespannt. Benjamin, nochmal danke für den Kommentar. Auch Christine und Gabriel, Ulrike, danke für eure Inputs und Diskussionsanregungen. Und damit wünsche ich euch einen wunderschönen Nachmittag heute.